I hope you can see some of my Christmas decorations in the background. Over here is a little ceramic type house. Got the little characters around it that it lights up. I like it real well. Sometimes I do a lot of fancy decorating around it to make it look full and like a little village. This time I just made it quite simple. And of course the tree behind my left, yeah, that's my left shoulder. I've had that a long time. And you can see my old Hoosier cabinet in the background. That'll always be one of my favorite items. Never did tell you how I got that, did I? I used to deal with a lady back home. She sold antiques out of her house, and her daughters would come from Ohio and bring things to her, and she would sell them. Well, we sort of traded back and forth, and I happened to have a room-size piece of carpet that my nephew had given me. Now, I don't know what I'd planned to do with it, but it was a very good piece, new and never been used, and this lady needed carpet for her bedroom. Well, she had the top half of a Hoosier cabinet, which is the one you see behind my left shoulder. This cabinet was painted with white buttermilk paint. It had the old worn look. Now, she didn't have the bottom half to it, but I really liked it. So we made a trade. I traded her my carpet for the Hoosier cabinet. So that's what you're looking at. So later on, Jan's father-in-law was into woodworking and refinishing furniture, and he stripped this cabinet for me, and I've just loved it ever since. Okay, that's enough about that. What I really was getting into was I was reading about the little brown bags that the children used to get at Christmas. Sometimes that's all they got for Christmas was an orange. There was always an orange and a peppermint stick or a peppermint little candy cane and a few nuts. Well, we all got those. I remember getting those too. And of course the orange was right down in the bottom of our stockings, and our stockings were those brown cotton stockings that had to pin up to your undershirt under your clothes in the wintertime. So, I was looking through my family history book, the one I had written, and I came across something about the old carnivals and circuses that came to town. Mama told me about my Aunt Margaret. I never knew her. She was my dad's older sister. And Aunt Margaret used to work the carnivals. And I was just shocked to hear that. And I said, what did she do? And she said, well, she sold cotton candy. Now, we're going back another century, whole century. And it's hard for me to imagine them having cotton candy back in those days. But that's what my Aunt Margaret sold at the carnivals. Well, that put me in mind again of the story Mama told me about my brother, my older brother. I don't know how many people you've ever heard of being sleepwalkers. My brother Bug was a sleepwalker. He kept it a secret. He didn't dare let any of his friends know that he walked in his sleep. And another thing was, of course, we were a big family. We slept 2 and 3 to a bed because we had to. So with so many girls and only him as the brother, he had to sleep with sister So he was sleeping in the front bedroom with my sister Jeanette. Jeanette slept on the outside of the bed because if he happened to get up during the night and walk in his sleep, he had to crawl across her to get out of the bed. So one night, middle of winter, everybody in the household was sound asleep, middle of the night. And they heard the awfulest crash ever was. Well, what they didn't know but could have guessed, Bug had gone to the foot of the bed and jumped through the window, screen and all. And Jeanette was just terrified, and Daddy came running, discovered what had happened. Daddy's in his long underwear. There wasn't time to put on shoes, put on clothes. He went out the front door and started out the street. My brother was running out the street, and Daddy had to catch up with him. And he brought him back into the house. And of course, that's when we had the pot-bellied stove in the living room, and it was still warm. So she saw that my brother was bleeding from the chin. The glass had cut his chin in a little scar right there. So Mama treated that and got it bandaged up, but she had to take him the next day to the doctor, and they had to put stitches in his chin. Bug would never tell his friends how he got the scar on his chin. He was too embarrassed. He knew they would tease him, and they would have. So, on one occasion, the carnival came to town. Well, I don't know if you've had the experience of circus and carnival coming to town once a year. Every kid in town planned for that, I'm going to say the carnival. They were begging Mom and Dad for a nickel and a dime because it would cost a nickel to get into the carnival, and then of course you had to have nickels and dimes for all of the rides and the cotton candy and things like that. Very exciting time. But there were still those kids that couldn't manage to have enough money to go to the carnival. So their friends would go to the back of the tent, big tent. Now this carnival was held, tell you the location, it was on Depot Street. Depot Street was where the train station was. Now the building downtown all had parking lots behind the buildings. So you had the long street with a lot of parking space, and that's where the carnival would set up. And I remember riding the swings one time. And if you've ever been on those swings go out and around and way. You start out like this, and as they swing, that you're going out and out and out. And I thought the swings were going to go right over the railroad tracks. What if a train came along just about the time I was going around? I was one of those that had motion sickness, couldn't even ride the merry-go-round, couldn't ride the tilt-a-whirl, couldn't ride any of those things, but I could ride the Ferris wheel because the Ferris wheel went this way, and it went pretty slow because each time it moved, another car was filled with passengers. Move on up again, and then you'd get to the very top, and you could see out all over the whole town. That's pretty exciting. So I'm trying to think where I was headed in this story. Oh, it was about Bug. Bug had been to the carnival with his friends, and Mama would let the girls, that would have been Jeanette and Benna May, they were younger, and she would let them go if Bug would go with them and keep an eye on them. She was afraid to let them go out at night by themselves. They were just young teenagers, 13, 14 years old. And so that night they came back. Bug had been tossing a ball. You know when they had those little ducks that run along the back and you throw a ball or a dart, and if you hit one of them, you win a prize. Well, Bug had won a prize, and the prize was a little set of figurines just about 2 inches tall, little dogs and cats. Sweet little things that any girl would love. So he gave those figurines to Jeanette. Mama had a little whatnot shelf in the living room on one wall, and that's where Jeanette put her little carnival figurines. She was so pleased. I mean, they were just really special to her. During the night, loud noises. Oh my gosh, what in the world is happening? Daddy's the first one out of bed into the living room to see what's going on. And my brother Bug was still asleep. And he had picked up those little figurines and was throwing them at the wall. And Daddy grabs him and tries to pull the little china figurines away from him. What are you doing, son? Well, of course, in the excitement and not knowing what's happening at the beginning, Daddy wasn't really aware that he was still asleep while he was throwing these figurines. And Daddy grabbed him by the arm, pulling the figurines out of his hand, and he said, "What are you doing, son?" And he says, "I'm trying to win a prize." He was dreaming that he was at the carnival, and he was throwing the figurines at the wall, trying to win a prize. I don't know if you've ever had anyone in your family that walked in their sleep. I don't recall anyone that I ever knew that did, and probably if they did, they wouldn't have told it, because that was a little bit embarrassing in those days. And then when I think about my Aunt Margaret, 100 years ago, she was working in a carnival. Did you know they had carnivals that far back? And after the carnival left, we would watch them load all of the equipment onto train cars, going to their next location. And there were always gypsies. Do you remember gypsies? They were fascinating in our town because they always came to town when the circus or the carnival was there. We didn't know much about them, but we were a little bit afraid of them. They wore fancy costumes. They always had these baubles and these fancy bracelets on their arms and big earrings and colorful costumes. And they lived in little trailers. I think you've probably seen some old European movies where they would have the traveling gypsies, and that's what they looked like. They were colorful costumes. Their skirts were in bright colors, ruffles, and they would have ruffles around the necks of their dresses. And I remember the big loop earrings Those things weren't very popular to the average lady at that time. But that's what the gypsies wore. Now, once a year, a carnival. The kids would go to the back of the tent. They'd sneak back there. And when there wasn't anybody around with the carnival that could see what they were doing, they would raise the bottom of the tent up just enough for their friend to crawl under. Because these were kids that didn't have the money for a ticket. You would find the older people at the carnival. They would buy a string of tickets, you know. Most of the rides were 10 cents. They'd buy a string of tickets, and they rode the tilt-a-whirl and the Ferris wheel, and you always had the fat lady that told you fortune. You could hear her laughing. Oh, she had this loud laugh. Fascinating situation. Something you only saw once a year. And you took in everything that you could. And of course, they had those tents that had the dancing ladies. Well, I never saw anything like that. Because for one thing, I didn't have the money. And it was usually the men that went in those tents. You know what I'm talking about. Where the ladies would dance. So, most of my time at the carnival was sitting on a bench, watching my friend ride the tilt-a-whirl, watching my friend going around and around on the merry-go-round. Now, one time, rode the swings. Whoa! Was I glad to get off of those things, because when they got going, they went fast and they went high. One time on the swings was my limit. But I do remember riding the Ferris wheel. And it reminds me of my great-grandmother who went to the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. Imagine a little old lady from the hills of Virginia and Tennessee. She was a grandmother, and she got to ride the train to St. Louis to the 1904 World's Fair. One of the most famous World Fair you'll ever hear about, and you've seen the movie Meet Me in St. Louis, Louis, with Judy Garland, one of my favorite movies. John Philip Sousa was there. You know who he was. Famous band leader. That was one of his first affairs, was at the St. Louis World Fair, and my great-grandmother was there. She told about the Ferris wheel. Now that Ferris wheel, it held, I would have to have the information. I've got a brochure that tells you all about that fair. And the cars were so large, they held 60 people in one car. And the description was, when you were at the top of that Ferris wheel, you could look out as far as 50 miles on a clear day. They had the gondolas. She got to see those things. Now you wonder how a lady from a big farm in Tennessee and Virginia could get to St. Louis. Well, she had an older son who was a supervisor for the railroad, and he was stationed in St. Louis, and he would send her passes. She got on the train in Middlesboro. Whole family was there to see her off. I can't even imagine how exciting it must have been, because I have no doubt that she was probably the only person from that part of the country that went to the St. Louis World Fair. I love to think about that, and when she came home, the children, which my mother was one of those children, they would sit in the swing in the dog trot. You know the dog trot, the center of the house. It's open. You've got this section of the house, this section of the house, and there's a dog trot. And Grandma Brooks had her swing in that section where she could sit in the evenings and watch the sun go down behind the hills. And those little girls would climb up in the swing with Grandma Brooks and say, "Tell us about the World's Fair, Grandma." And the main thing they wanted to hear was the goose that laid the golden egg. We all know that fairy tale. But Grandma Brooks saw the goose that laid the golden eggs, and oh, their eyes would pop open big and bright when she would describe this huge gold egg. Of course, that fascinated those little girls, my mother, Lizzie, and her younger sister, Renee. That was my memories of carnivals. Carnivals were the most exciting thing the year round that could happen to a child in those days. We're talking 80 to 90 years ago. If the circus came to town, you had to go. And you got there even if you had to sneak under the tent, the big tent. And I loved watching the fat lady laugh. Oh, she was fat and she could laugh. Simple little memories like that. What children would do today to have those experiences, and to think that a big cone of pink and green and blue cotton candy was the hit of the day. I hope you've enjoyed this story. There's so much more that could be told, and about the Gypsies. We didn't see the Gypsies but once a year. And they would stay after the carnival was gone. They were an unwanted tribe of people. They weren't trusted in those days. So a lot of stories and tales went around about the Gypsies. And after a few weeks, they would be gone too. And there would just be the memories left of the carnival that came to town. Thank you for watching again. And tell your friend to check on some of my stories. They might not like all of them, but there's going to be one or two come along that they can connect to. And I like telling my stories. They put me in touch with my mother's youth, childhood, and my sisters. They would tell the same story that my mother would tell. But the one about my brother being a sleepwalker. Tell me, has there ever been a sleepwalker in your family? I'd like to hear that story too. So thank you for watching again. And I hate to say, it's another gloomy, rainy day. And what do? You go to the kitchen, you cook, you wash dishes, then you come back, you take a nap, and then I get my books out and I check and say, what story can I tell them today? I hope you like this one. Thanks a bunch.